We just landed here in the North Sea.
Been traveling for 5 days to get to this field.
I've never seen anything like this in real life.
I said put him down, now!
Super hard to breathe in here.
Let me get comfortable.
This makes me nervous. This feels very precarious.
Oi! Oh, shit.
The Buzzkill Division, Syria Police.
We are about to spend the night in jail to get to know some of the women a little bit better.
What is this universe that we're living in?
Some of the most at-risk real estate in the world is here in Miami.
Believe it or not, we are actually in Syria.
This is turning out to be much more difficult and extreme than I expected.
Go, go, go.
Vice on HBO, the Sesame magazine. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Of course. So we'll talk specifically about your pieces. You know, you have a wonderful piece where you're in Aleppo, and you have an incredible piece where you're talking to transgender youth and sort of the different stages that transgender youth go to when it sort of comes to identifying themselves. But let's talk about how you got involved with Vice and what you think the sort of main mission behind Vice on HBO is.
So I came from a very untraditional journalism route, unlike Gianna, I think. I was based in China. I was getting experience over there. I actually ended up working for Chinese state TV, which taught me a lot about everything I don't want to be doing in journalism in terms of...
It teach you a lot about American media in a couple of years, I think.
I think it was good training for that, yeah. But yeah, it's a lot of self-censorship. It's a lot of having to think of what the government would want to portray.
And that plays a lot into your piece on Aleppo. I mean, I think that made you very qualified for engaging with
dealing with state censorship. Yeah, and I mean, it also taught me a lot about the types of topics I want to cover and how I want the stories to mean something rather than going to a place for the sake of going somewhere or traveling for the sake of traveling. And so I started pitching stories. I started working in print and started pitching stories to various UK and Western publications. And then I ended up working for Vice through pitching a story in China, actually on an annual dog meat festival, which haunts me to this day because...
Say that again. On a what festival?
An annual dog meat festival.
Fantastic.
Isobel may or may not have tasted dog meat.
Oh, thank you. Which will haunt me till the rest of my days because what I realized from doing that is that people care a lot more about animals than they do about humans. And so every year I get a lot of abuse for covering that and doing it in the Vice manner, which is something that I've really wanted to do, which is very immersive, long-form documentaries.
So you made a long-form documentary at the Chinese annual dog eating festival.
I did, yes.
How did it? And you found that people particularly care more about humans or care more about dogs than humans?
A lot of people, yeah. Yeah, I think it's easier to care about animals than it is about humans.
There's no complexity.
Yeah, they're way simpler to deal with. I love my dog sometimes more than I love my boyfriend, and it was very apparent. It got a lot of views, and I think it's a topic that people can really get on board with.
And Gianna, how did you start working at Vice, or what was your journalism background?
So I worked at ABC News for a couple years and eventually quit. It's, I think, tough with network news. All the stories are becoming so short, and it's really difficult to, I feel like, tell a thorough story, especially on the big issues that we're covering at Vice when you only have, 3 minutes or 1 minute.
It's very difficult. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I think one of the things that you do so well in your stories on Vice is making them a little bit longer, which sort of helps to get rid of what feels like any kind of spin. When you have a 3-minute segment, you have a 2.5-minute segment, it feels like it can be spun into a very specific narrative very quickly.
Sure, and when you're booking guests, you're talking to people who are at the center of these issues, and you're telling them, we want to give you a voice, we want you to be able to, explain what you're going through right now. And then they always ask, okay, well, how much time am I going to have to explain my issue? Telling them 30 seconds is not a great sell, right? But telling them that the films are going to be 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, or longer, that gives them, a fair shot to really explain what they're going through. So for me, I worked at Al Jazeera too, and I eventually quit and joined Vice for that reason. I felt like Vice was really giving these stories the time they deserved, and they were allowing us to have a good amount of creative control over the storytelling process.
And not to get on a network news bash or anything for too long, but I also think with those 2.5-minute, 3-minute pieces, they are in many ways the scourge of what's happening in this country right now, in the sense that quite often you don't even get the perspective of the people who are living in these situations. You get the perspective of the people who shape the policy, because they're the ones who can speak in sound bites that make for a good 2.5-minute segment. So you are essentially only getting spin, be it for the, for the betterment of whatever the subject is about, or maybe for the worst, depending on who you're talking to.
Sure, I think it allows people in power to control the narrative a little more easily. But we should remember that viewers are enjoying shorter segments, right? These networks are still getting millions and millions of views a day. I don't know if I believe that people have shorter attention spans. For me, I was always annoyed being told that millennials have very short attention spans. There isn't an appetite for long-form documentaries. I think what we realized in doing these documentaries is that young people do want them, they just want them differently. They want them presented in a way where they feel like they're hearing from their friend. They feel like that could be them, in Syria or in India telling these stories. So it might be less about the time that we're giving these stories and more about the presentation of them.
Was that different for the two of you in the way that you make these documentaries, sort of adapting to being a host and to being someone who presents these stories as if you were someone's friend, or was that something that you were naturally comfortable with and sort of knew how to do?
Go ahead.
And, excuse me, I'll just add to that. How different do you see that from the way, Katie Couric presented a story in 2008 or something?
I mean, for me, I think for both of us, it's such an important aspect of our jobs to empathize with characters and to feel what they're feeling and to try and convey that to an audience, to try and make someone understand what it's like to be in someone else's shoes in a different part of the world, in the same part of the world, whatever they're going through, to try and experience some of that. And I think that Vice allows you to really empathize with your characters because you're allowed to build up those characters and to get to understand and to know them. I think that it's something that I always struggle with, to figure out where you're comfortable with. You're told as a journalist you're supposed to step back and to be able to have some distance. And I find that really, really difficult when you're in these situations. You're talking to rape victims who have been through the most horrendous atrocities in the world, and you just want to hold their hand and you want to cry with them and you want to feel what they're going through. And I think that our audience appreciates that, and I think that it's okay to experience that. And I think that that's something that I've become more accustomed to and grown more comfortable with. I kind of think of preparing for a piece as reading up everything that I can about something, really doing my research, and then getting there and trying to forget everything and to get to know the people that we're talking to.
Just to add on to what Isobel said, and I agree and experience, a lot of the same things that she just explained. We should remember that, people, from CBS and other networks for years were taking fire in Vietnam. They were doing really great journalism, and there still are people, of course, who are doing great journalism, embedding, in these really dangerous and high-pressure situations. But I think news has evolved over the years, and I think when I got into the business, I started wondering, why is that person doing that interview in a designer dress when she's talking to people who are going through the most difficult time in their life? To me, it didn't make sense, and I think I had the opportunity to be in the room during some of those interviews, and I think I just realized that I wanted to be asking the questions because I wanted people on the other side of the interview to see me as a real person, and as someone who saw them as a real person and someone on their level.
Or why are these people in designer dresses or suits going to these blue-collar towns where supposedly Trump supporters are and just asking them, why do you support Donald Trump, and then walking away? Why are they not asking them about the issues that they care about or helping educate them about the issues that they care about? It's all in many ways unintentionally exploitational, I would say. And I think it is symptomatic of the medium itself and the evolution of the medium.
And I think all of us are guilty of not having listened close enough this election season, and there's so many journalists who have come out and said that, I think this is, a huge lesson, and we're not exactly political reporters, but we do tell stories that are at the core of our country and that are big stories in an election season. And yeah, I think everyone learned that lesson. We need to be staying for longer. We need to be listening to people more thoroughly.
That said, you say you're not political reporters, and I think one of the things that I liked about both of your pieces is that you do try to divorce the stories from the sort of American politics of the moment, the sort of nitty-gritty of policy that is being set, and try to focus on the people. Is that difficult for you, especially? I mean, you're in the midst of Aleppo. It's just before Aleppo fell. There's so much. I mean, that had to have been nearing the end of the election or just after the election had happened, right? And there's so much talk about whether or not Obama's foreign policy in Syria had failed the people as well as even further destabilized the region. And then at the same time, you're talking to transgender youth, and Obama has recently passed an executive order to make sure that transgender youth can use the bathrooms that are in line with their identity, and now Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions and Betsy DeVos are trying to roll that back. So the policies are being shaped in the midst of you doing these very specific reports on the human beings that are affected by the policy, but it also seems that you're trying really hard to remove the policy from the conversation so it doesn't feel politically slanted in any way.
I think it's...
long-winded question, I'm sorry.
That's okay. No, it's okay. I mean, I think it's impossible to avoid politics in these stories. They're woven into, I would say, every single story that we do. Sometimes politics tend to dominate stories and you sort of lose what the essence of the story is. So with the trans story, what was important to us is that we didn't get into this sort of political game of ping pong. Instead, we looked at the science of it. We looked at the medical transitions at each stage for these children. I think if we had allowed politicians to yell at each other, I'm not sure the viewers would have really understood what the trans community is going through, especially what children are going through and what their parents are going through at those pivotal stages.
That said, I think you do a great job of posing some of the questions to people that politicians that are a part of the sort of, I don't know how you would say, anti-transgender movement or whatever they are, hateful, sorry. You do pose some of those questions to people in the documentary, but it's different watching you pose it than it would be hearing the sort of talking points that they have.
It's important to ask those questions, you know, to bring up the other side of the argument, because that isn't just the argument of politicians. That's the argument of millions of Americans. There are millions of Americans who don't believe that transgender kids should be using the bathroom of their gender identity. And so that's a perspective you have to address. You know, you have to bring that to the families. You have to bring that to the doctors. You have to bring that to former Attorney General Loretta Lynch, because without, I think, bringing up the other side of the story, you're not exactly telling the story in a fair way.
So much of your story in Aleppo, I think, you know, will go back to how you work for state-sponsored media in China, and this idea of finding what the real narrative is there, and the narrative that they shape, and then also the narrative that we shape here about Syria. You have the Republicans shaping a specific narrative. You have the Obama administration shaping a specific narrative. You have Trump throwing as many narratives at the wall and seeing what sticks. But what was it like for you trying to get the truth and trying to understand what the objective reality is in Syria?
It was tough. You know, you go in under a dictatorship and you're very aware that you're only getting one side of the story. We had a government minder with us the entire time. Actually, this incredible guy called Basil, who was an absolute Anglophile and was obsessed with British culture. His ringtone was the BBC World Service, and he learned his he learned his English through watching Fawlty Towers. So obviously we got on really well.
So he worked for the government, and he was with you the whole time?
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, he was this amazing guy, but his job was to ensure that we weren't seeing anything the government didn't want us to see, that we weren't doing anything that the government didn't want us to do, that we weren't talking to anyone who said the wrong thing at all. So getting to the truth.
Even when you're in, sorry, I hate to interrupt you, but there's amazing moments where you're interviewing citizens who could air grievances about the government, but he's standing there, and do they generally know who he is usually when he's standing there?
Absolutely, they know who he is.
Crazy.
Yeah, and I think some of the most revealing moments in our documentary were the ones where things went a little bit wrong and he didn't have complete control of it. Someone maybe whispered something to me or was talking off air, or, you know, there were these extremely telling moments, one of which was when we were talking on the street with people, and this woman came up to us because she saw that we were with the national security, and she started airing some grievances that she had about the security. She had some complaints. She said that someone from the security was stealing her things. And out of nowhere, we didn't even realize that too many security people were with us. Out of nowhere, 3 or 4 security people took her away, stopped us from filming at all. We were completely blocked, and we were blocked out of that scene completely. And when I asked one of the government officials, what was going on, why aren't we allowed to film this? His response was, "Have you read 1984?" And I think a moment like that is more telling than a lot of the other moments where we were able to talk with people, or that had the illusion of talking with people freely. And I think that the audience can very clearly see and make up their mind as to what is going on there and how a dictatorship is run.
Talk about interviewing the host of the sort of state-sponsored morning show.
Yeah, that was great. It was actually incredibly awkward because we were sat there, we were on this morning talk show in Syria.
I loved it.
I was wearing more makeup than I'm wearing now. It was awful. And I guess I started going off script because it was incredibly frustrating because these talk show hosts were sat there, they were asking me a lot of questions. They were clearly trying to sort of twist the narrative a bit because they were like, so why are you reporting on Syria in this way? And then they would say to the camera, you can see from the way that she's reporting this that she clearly has a narrative in mind, that she's coming from the West to show that their perspective of what they think Syria is true. So it was incredibly difficult and it was really frustrating. And so I was talking to the host, and at the same time, I was trying to ask my questions as to, what is the media here for? And why are you only allowed to show this story? And why are you not allowed to answer any of my questions? And at the same time, I had the producer in my ear, because this was live TV, just nattering away at me and just gradually getting louder and louder and more irate.
The producer of their show was in your ear?
Yeah, absolutely. It was so awkward. No one really wanted to look me in the eye after that.
That's so interesting, and that brings me the narrative that they're trying to shape. And when they talk about the West, there is a point that they have when they talk about the destabilization of Iraq and the destabilization of Libya that the United States had a huge role in. So we can, as much as we want, say to them, well, the West is right, and the Assad regime should fall, and we should reshape this into a sort of in the mold of a Western democracy. And sure, they may have like a propagandistic narrative, but they always have a point when they say, well, what are you going to do? Make us like Iraq? What are you going to do? Make us like Libya? And it's almost like you have to fall back. And how do you even sort of puncture that narrative at that point?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that in some ways that and America's history in the Middle East has really it's putty in their hands, in the Syrian government's hands, and they've been able to hack that and to use it to their advantage. Everyone, I think, or at least most people in Syria, are deeply disappointed with the US and with Western involvement in the country, both on the opposition side, where they feel like they should have been supporting them because they're fighting for democracy and they're fighting for all these things and they're fighting for revolution, and on the government side because they feel like they're a legitimate government and they should receive the West's help in terms of defeating ISIS. And I think that, the US has in some ways supported, in a very limited way, supported the opposition side, extremely limited way. And that has also played into the government's hands because they can say, anyone, according to the government, who is the opposition is a terrorist. And so they see the West as supporting terrorists within the country, and they can say that the government is the one who can protect security. The government is the only one who can uphold secularism in the country. And a lot of people buy into that narrative because they're tired. They've been at war for 6 years. They don't want it to turn into Iraq or Libya, and they don't want this to continue forever. And they see the government can and will protect some form of normalcy in the country and return to some form of what they had before.
What's so interesting, a lot of the people who said that we should do more in Syria are also the people who back a sort of limit on refugees that we take in, and this sort of idea of extreme vetting or the travel ban alone, when in actuality the only thing that we were possibly doing to help people in Syria was accepting refugees.
Yeah, and it's so clear that, the people who are seeking refuge outside, the people, half the population in Syria is now displaced, and those people who are fleeing the regime are not the same people that we met. They're not the same people who are enjoying a life of some form of stability under the government. They're the ones who are fleeing torture. numerous, I mean, we don't even know how many people, the reports just keep getting worse and worse. There's 13,000 people hanged in a state prison, chemical weapons used on their own people in Aleppo. These are things that we don't know, and those are the people who are fleeing the regime, and those are the people who need the most help. And sadly, those are the people a lot of the international community is turning their back on.
Gianna, one of the things that I loved about your piece, and I guess my question is actually, how did you go about finding the subjects for this specific piece on transgender youth? Because what I loved is that you seem to find a wonderful cross-section of people who you wouldn't expect their parents to immediately be accepting of having a transgender child. They're knowing exactly what to do right away, and they themselves had to kind of come to their own terms or sort of deal with their own ignorance about the subject.
We had a great team working on this piece and pitching and developing it, Nicole Bezorgmir and Hendrik Hinsel, and as a team we called different organizations and trans communities across the country, and I think one thing that was important to us is that we represented what was happening in the country. So we didn't just talk to trans children in big, urban cities. We made sure to go to small towns in Texas and small towns outside of Boston. A couple of actually two of the parents we talked to, one was an ordained minister outside of Houston, and another one was the pastor of a church outside of Boston. And definitely for Kimberly, who's the minister in Texas, she says herself, she screamed at her child, she beat her child, she had a really hard time understanding what her child was going through. And for us, it's important to show that struggle because that struggle is real, and there are families across the country that are going through that. So by talking to a lot of families and hearing their stories, I think we were looking for that diversity, and we were also looking for people who were genuine in their storytelling, who were being honest. And I think, with any story you do, you're looking for people who aren't exactly, wanting to jump in front of the camera and perform for you. You're wanting to talk to people who are maybe a little more reserved and are thoughtful in their storytelling, and also people that the audience can relate to.
Was there a reason, and I prefer it, but was there a reason that you decided not to interview anybody of the sort of opposition, for lack of a better word, in regards to sort of the transgender movement?
I think it goes back to, we didn't want this to be a political story. I feel like whenever this subject comes up, whether it's in TV or print, it's always a political story. It's always about the bathroom laws, and there's just so much beyond that. And we felt like the science behind it wasn't given enough airtime. And for us, that's really what these families are dealing with. They're not, they are dealing with the bathroom laws, and the kids are affected by it, but the day-to-day decisions and the agony that comes with going through this experience is really about transitioning.
That leads me to another question. I mean, in terms of in not interviewing the opposition, I think you do a wonderful job of profiling the people who are actually going through this, and I'm curious what the both of you think about the majority of news media's focus on making sure that they have both a representative of one idea and a representative of the other idea, no matter how absurd the other idea or the one idea may seem to be. That is the idea of maintaining objectivity in the news. Do you think there is a necessity for that kind of objectivity in news moving forward?
I mean, I think that what we try to do is, as one of my idols, Christiane Amanpour, would say, is that it's about truth, it's not about neutrality. And I think that, yes, it's important to talk to both sides. It's not necessarily important how many minutes you give or how many seconds you give to each side. What is important is that you hold those people accountable, and that you are real about what is true and what isn't true, and you present them with the facts, and you make them answer to those facts.
Before I move on to questions from the audience, you being journalists and being members of the press, as your flak jacket says, while you are in Aleppo, it's called a flak jacket, right? Is that what it's called? What do you think of Donald Trump's recent attacks on the press, calling them the enemy of the American people?
We were talking about this yesterday, actually.
We were talking about it backstage a couple minutes ago.
I mean, as Isobel said yesterday, it's definitely it's forcing journalists more than they already are to be double, triple checking their facts and making sure that they don't slip up in any way, not to give him anything to use. I think it's incredibly disturbing. a leader in his own party, Senator John McCain, came out and said this type of behavior and the way he's treating the press right now is the first step toward dictatorship.
But then he voted for all of his cabinet members.
Right. Well, yeah, it's tough. I mean, it's tough. I think attacks on the press are not just dangerous for our country, right? Journalism being such a key pillar of democracy, but I think it's dangerous for the rest of the world because they see us as the golden standard, right? They look to us to free their journalists from prisons or pressure their oppressive governments when journalists are in prison. If we no longer become that example, other countries will be affected. It won't just be ours.
Having said that, I think it's a really exciting time to be a journalist in the US and around the world. I think that there's never felt like a more important time to be really digging into these stories, to not just necessarily be getting the access or the interviews or to be interviewing Donald Trump, but to be going beyond the headlines and to really be talking to the people and to be trying to figure out how they feel and to create some form of empathy for the people who are living in America and beyond.
Absolutely. Let's hear some questions right here.
I'm wondering, given the intensity of the stories you cover and Vice's reporting style, how do you make sure you don't take home that emotional weight? Or do you, and then how do you deal with that?
I cry.
I text Isobel emojis that make us happy. No, I mean, it's tough. Another thing we were talking about yesterday is I was telling Isobel a story of when we did the piece on international surrogacy, and on the last day we were there, we sort of stumbled upon a scene that we didn't expect, which was that there was an underground surrogacy agent who tried to sell us a baby that was right there, a 15-day-old baby. And something about sitting at that table and seeing this baby and knowing that that woman didn't know anything about my history, didn't know, if I had an abusive history or, if I was a pedophile. She didn't know my name, and she was just telling me to put a down payment to buy this child. That disturbed me for
Where
weeks.
was this? I'm sorry?
This was in India. Yeah. Incredibly disturbing. I think talking about it helps, though, and I think being in the field and in a case like Isobel spending weeks in Syria, I would imagine, because this is what we do on the shoots that I'm on, you have to talk about it and you have to keep good humor. You have to be joking about other stuff and focusing on other stuff. Otherwise, you won't survive.
Yeah, I think I'm extremely fortunate to have a family and a friend network and support around me so that you can talk about it. I mean, it's definitely not good dinner chat conversation to bring it back. And yeah, I've been in South Sudan last week. I was covering the famine. What have you been doing? I think there's a time and a place to do it. But we're incredibly fortunate in our work as well. We have so many colleagues that we can share these stories with. It is tough. You take that emotional toll with you. You wear those scars, and it's impossible for it not to affect you. I still get torn up when I think about some of the things that we've seen in some of the people that we talk to. But I think being able to talk about it and to keep healthy and to have some form of escape when you get back here and to have a good home when you get back is how you deal with it, or how I try.
Next question.
I was wondering, since you guys obviously have to have a passion for each topic and project you take on, how going through it do you remain sort of as unbiased as possible and not like interject your own, mission, if that makes sense?
I think it's just about letting the characters in the story share their opinions and share their own narratives. And I think, when you come to post-production, you're extremely careful with the way that you're wording things, and you're making sure that you're talking to the right people. It wouldn't make sense to do a political story and talk to the smartest people on the right and then a fringe group on the left. You have to judge those things appropriately.
If you're Breitbart, it would.
I also think that, it's hard to be completely unbiased, as you said, and to call people up when you feel, if you're watching someone beating up a child, or if you're talking to someone who has a history of raping people, you're going to call them up and you're going to say this is wrong. And I think that you're the best gauge of what is wrong and what is right. And I think that the audience appreciates you being able to do so.
I think I have time for one more. Right there.
Hi.
You have a microphone.
I
Ask
do,
a question.
yes. So I was wondering, when you go into working on a story, do you know what you're going to tell and the narrative that you want to bring out through the story, or does it change at all, as you're talking to people?
Yeah, I think we obviously have a story in mind and we have a goal in mind, and we sort of know what scenes we want to walk into and what we want to sort of get out of those scenes. And inevitably, those stories always change. I was in South Sudan last week, and you know, we've heard stories of the atrocities there, and we know the history of the place. We know how implicit the US has been in creating independence there, but we were expecting people to be appalled at the notion of, you know, Trump suggesting that he's going to cut UN funding. And on the ground, that's not the story at all. We came across a Trump rally where people were outright supporting him and hoping for the best and extremely optimistic about what the future holds. So I think that being open to what's going on around you and actually talking to so many people on the ground is a really, really crucial element of getting the right story, not the story that you want to tell.
Can I ask what their reasons for support were?
South Sudanese have been more supportive of the Republicans than they have traditionally of the Democrats. They're extremely supportive of George W. Bush. And they felt like they wanted a regime change. They're not happy with what Obama's done for the country. It's in a dire state. Famine was declared in parts of the country yesterday. And they're hoping that Trump's America First will actually help them in some way to allow them some sovereignty. This is obviously not speaking for everyone in the country. I'm speaking for certain
this rally
circles.
That you found. Yeah.
Yes. But yeah, they were hoping for a change, basically.
Vice on HBO is on Sunday nights, right? Or
Friday night.
Friday nights, excuse me. What time on Friday nights?
11 p.m.
At 11 p.m. It's the best news magazine show on television. Thank you so much for being here. Congratulations on your pieces and the show.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky.
Thank you.